Welcome to This Explainer. We're jumping right into over 2 millennia of Kenyan history today. We are going to look at how a truly enduring, relentless battle for the very soil of the country fundamentally shaped the incredibly diverse nation we see today. Kenya's story is one of deep geography, marked heavily by the Great Rift Valley, and, as you'll see, profound human resilience.
To really ground our understanding from the get-go, we have to look at this extremely powerful motto, land and freedom. Now, this was historically the cry of the Kikuyu people, but it's honestly the critical motif we've got to follow for the entire country. Because to truly grasp the complex story of Kenya, you absolutely must first understand the historical battle for its land. It's the cornerstone of its pre-colonial social organization, it was the main target of its colonial trauma, and, well, it's the root of its modern political struggles.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be navigating through 6 key eras: origins and trade, the shadow of colonial rule, the Mau Mau Uprising, the road to independence, politics, ethnicity and violence, and finally, modern Kenya, trials and triumphs. Let's dive right in.
Part 1. Origins, Migration, and Trade. The early battle for fertile soil.
We're starting our journey way back in the ancient past, looking at the deep roots of Kenya's diverse population. Long before any modern borders were ever drawn on a map, this region was defined by intense competition for water, for pasture, and for those wonderfully fertile volcanic soils left behind by the Rift Valley. And it wasn't just one single planned expedition that settled the area. It happened in 3 massive ancient waves of migration. Starting around 2000 BC, the Nilotic people arrived as pastoralists, essentially looking for grazing land. Then, between 200 and 500 AD, Cushitic speakers migrated into the northeastern regions. And finally, starting around 500 AD, a huge wave of cultivators arrived.
That final wave? That was the Bantu expansion. Fun fact, the term Bantu translates simply to human beings. This was a sprawling, continent-shifting ethno-linguistic movement that brought agriculture, iron, and copper metallurgy into East Africa over a period of 2 millennia. This wave was completely pivotal because it catalyzed a massive competition for land and livestock, a competition that remains absolutely central to Kenya's modern socio-political landscape, even today.
Section 2. The Shadow of Colonial Rule. The Scramble for Africa and the White Highlands.
So, let's fast forward to the late 19th century. The 1885 Berlin Conference basically triggered the European scramble for Africa. Britain imposed a protectorate over Kenya, and they drew boundaries with zero regard for how the indigenous people actually lived. But what's really wild is how distinctly traumatic Britain's approach was here compared to its other colonies. They treated Kenya as a white man's country, completely uprooting the native population to create the White Highlands for about 50,000 European settlers. If you look at neighboring Uganda, cattle diseases and transport issues delayed white settlement there, which forced some concessions. Over in Nigeria, local native administration was actually somewhat protected. But in Kenya, natives were forced off their ancestral, highly fertile lands and pushed into miserable reserves just to provide a source of cheap labor.
Which brings us to Part 3, Mau Mau and the Uprising, the cry for land and freedom.
You can imagine the boiling pot of grievances on the ground at this point, right? This devastating loss of ancestral lands and the confinement of the native population ignited one of the most famous rebellions in African history. It was this complex, multi-ethnic revolution against colonial oppression, but also against the loyalist elites who were collaborating with the British. Massive land alienation, high taxes, and forced labor basically pushed the Kikuyu, Embu, Meru, and other groups right to the breaking point. The rebellion utilized secret oathing and guerrilla violence that literally spanned from the dense Aberdaze forests all the way to urban zones like Nairobi. In response, the British government declared a state of emergency in 1952 and rolled out a notoriously brutal containment policy known as the pipeline.
100,000. I really want you to let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering, estimated number of suspected Mau Mau members and sympathizers who were swept into colonial concentration camps. The British authorities arbitrarily detained massive numbers of people, including many women, by the way, who were deeply involved in funding and organizing the movement, subjecting them to forced labor, extreme torture, and brutal interrogations.
Section 4. The Road to Independence and the Transition to Self-Rule.
While the Mau Mau movement was largely defeated in terms of armed combat, they were absolutely not silenced. The sheer cost and devastation of that emergency forced the British government to a pretty stark realization. There was no way Kenya could be controlled indefinitely without completely draining British resources. Suddenly, the path to self-rule was wide open, and the transition was incredibly rapid and, frankly, quite turbulent. From the violent state of emergency in 1952, we jump to 1960, which saw the formation of the very first major political party, the Kenya African National Union, or KANU. And then finally, on December 12, 1963, independence was proclaimed, with nationalist leader Jomo Kenyatta stepping up to guide the newly sovereign nation.
But, this is where the story takes a rather complicated turn. Independence wasn't some magic wand that suddenly fixed the foundational issue of land inequality. Actually, the new Kenyan horticultural bourgeoisie and the remaining Euro-Kenyan settlers essentially got to keep all their prime real estate. Meanwhile, the landless freedom fighters, the folks who had literally bled for this independence, felt deeply betrayed. The colonial-era land distribution largely remained intact, leaving them completely dispossessed.
Part 5. Politics, Ethnicity and Violence, the Persistent Scars of Tribalism. Because those structural issues of land and wealth were never truly fixed, all that unresolved tension carried directly into the post-independence era. Kenya is an incredibly culturally rich place. There are 42 distinct ethnic languages spoken there today by groups with their own amazing cultures and histories. But tragically, this incredible diversity has frequently been manipulated. Instead of having ideological debates about policy, political parties became vehicles for landholding elites to stoke sectarianism. They actively use these ethnic identities to polarize the electorate just to protect their own interests.
And we really saw the horrific peak of this political manipulation during the post-election violence of 2007 and 2008. It was triggered initially by a highly controversial presidential poll, but what started as political protests rapidly shifted into a cataclysmic eruption of ethnic revenge attacks. Over 1,000 people died and there was widespread destruction. But if you look underneath the immediate political trigger, the violence was fundamentally rooted in those exact same, long-standing historical, land and territorial grievances we've been tracking since the very beginning of this explainer. Finally, Section 6, Modern Kenya, Trials and Triumphs, Economic Growth Amidst Environmental Challenges.
Despite a history marked by so much deep conflict and trauma, modern Kenya has actually emerged as a remarkably resilient regional powerhouse. They've got a buoyant economy, they serve as a major diplomatic hub for East Africa, and they boast a globally recognized cultural heritage. The absolute bedrock of that modern economy, it's agriculture. It accounts for nearly a quarter of Kenya's entire GDP and employs around 74% of the economically active population, mostly smallholder farmers. It relies heavily on livestock and cash crops, think tea and coffee, which make up a massive portion of their exports. But it's not easy going. They face persistent challenges because they rely heavily on rain-fed farming due to highly underdeveloped irrigation systems.
And today, Kenya's resilience is being severely tested by its environment. The country is essentially performing this massive, delicate balancing act. On one side, rapid population growth is leading to severe deforestation. We're talking annual forest loss between 0.5 and 5.5% in some areas, alongside much more frequent and devastating droughts linked to climate change. But on the flip side, Kenya is achieving tremendous conservation triumphs. Their extensive national park system protects incredibly high biodiversity and fuels a booming wildlife tourism industry, which alone accounts for about 80% of their foreign tourist receipts.
So, stepping back and looking at the big picture, it's clear that Kenya's modern reality is a true land of contradictions. It's a nation characterized by immense hope, but, for sure, also fear. It features rapid economic hubs and vibrant diversity, and yet it is still so deeply anchored to its ancient migrations and that enduring, unresolved fight for the very soil beneath its feet.
I want to leave you with this one provocative thought to chew on. After looking at this sprawling, complex history, from ancient pastoral migrations to colonial land grabs, and from the Mau Mau Uprising to modern economic development, how do you think Kenya can best reconcile its deeply complex past to build a truly unified and equitable future? It's a question that goes way beyond just history. It's about the very blueprint of nation building. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.